So I wanted to talk a little bit about how much free advertising Canopy Growth can realistically expect to get. And I've mentioned this before, but when you're the biggest company in an industry, especially when you're the biggest company in a new industry, people tend to look at you first whenever they look at the industry as a whole. So whenever you look at marijuana or marijuana stocks, pretty much every single time that you look at marijuana stocks, Canopy Growth is at the top of the list. People talk about Canopy Growth the most whenever they talk about marijuana stocks. And this sort of thing has the benefit of giving you a lot of free advertising because when legalization takes place, the same thing is going to occur. Whenever people are going to be talking about the newly legalized marijuana industry in Canada, they're going to be taking a look at Canopy Growth the first because it's going to be having some of the most well-known brands and it's going to be the biggest company out there. So people are going to be looking at it a lot. And that's going to serve as free advertising. So to give you an analogy to this, being the biggest company in a new industry is fairly similar to being the biggest clown in a clown fest, for lack of a better phrase. And the most well scenario that's known is Donald Trump. And Donald Trump got about $5 billion worth of free media advertising when he was running for the presidency. And the way that he did this is by saying a lot of really obnoxious or just unusual things. And basically, all he had to do was talk about some Mexicans or something and the media was going to run clips about him for the next week, pretty much 24/7. And this wasn't necessarily even anything new. I mean, if you go take a look at his book, The Art of the Deal, it's pretty much in here. So he talks about it. He says it's the nature of the job, and I understand that. The point is that if you're a little bit different or a little bit outrageous, or if you do things bold or controversial, the press is going to write about you. And then a little bit further on, sometimes they write positively and sometimes they write negatively, but from a business point of view, the benefits of being written about far outweigh the drawbacks. So if you get mentioned in the media a lot, if you're a company, if you're a person, whatever it may be, but if you get mentioned in the media a lot, it has a major advantage of just serving as free press. Sure, some people might not like you, but the free press is still free advertising essentially. And Donald Trump is basically the best example of how that's done. I mean, he probably set the record for the most free media advertising that has ever been gotten. I mean, he got a ridiculous amount, $5 billion, that's just ridiculous. But anyways, Canopy Growth is in a similar situation where they may be able to get a bunch of free advertising because people are going to be talking about the marijuana industry, and they're probably going to mention Canopy Growth at some point because it is the biggest company. And that would serve as free advertising. So to put a monetary value on this is fairly difficult, but I am going to try to do it, and just do be aware that I don't have a lot of experience in advertising. I have done advertising before, but it's been fairly minimal. I will do more advertising in the future. That is part of my career, but haven't quite gotten there. So just take this with a grain of salt. This might not be fully accurate, but I'm going to explain everything that I do. So, anyways, first of all, I want to look at I tried to looking at what advertising costs on different platforms, TV, newspapers, media, whatever it may be. Also, just tried looking at a few different things, how many people watch the news and stuff like that. But in the end, I don't think that it really matters. So I'm going to take every single way that Canopy Growth can possibly gain exposure and pretty much merge it together, because regardless of whether a person hears about Canopy Growth on TV or whether or not they read an article online and then Google, marijuana companies and come across Canopy Growth, I don't think that really matters too much. Sure, it costs differently to advertise on TV than it does online, but in the end, you're pretty much getting the same thing for the most part. So we're just going to merge all of that together and just average it out and just say that it all goes together, right? So I've tried looking at this sort of stuff, how many people watch news, how people get their news, but it doesn't really matter, I don't think. So anyways, not Canopy Growth, Canada has 36 million people, and these people are going to be the most relevant ones in terms of advertising. So 36 million people. If we take a look at the age demographics, we can see that about 18% is not really relevant at all. We don't really want anybody 14 years or younger. I mean, the advertising to them is not really relevant. And 15 through 19-year-olds, they're kind of relevant, but they're not fully relevant. So we're going to lump this into so we're going to basically cut a little bit over half of this out. So we're going to cut 4% out of this, right? So 22% of the population is not really relevant when it comes to advertising because they're underage and not even close to becoming of age where the advertising would actually matter. So we don't care about those people. We do care about the older people because they might be interested in the medical factor of marijuana, and if they hear about Canopy Growth, it's still going to be relevant. So we're going to be taking 22% of the population out. So 22% of 36 million, then you subtract that number from 36 million, you get 28 million left, right? So we have 28 million people that are actually relevant of age in Canada. And from those people, about half have probably done marijuana at some point in their life. In the US, polls have been taken, it's about half. It's been increasing over the past few years, but we're going to say half. So then we're going to say this number and we're going to slice it and we're going to get it to 14 million people that are relevant. Now, out of some people, from some people that haven't done marijuana, some might be interested in doing it, and same thing with people that have done marijuana. Some people that have done marijuana might not be interested in it, so we're just going to take those numbers and basically combine them and just half the 28 number. Half this number, and 14 million I think is a fair estimate of the people that are at least somewhat relevant in terms of advertising too. Like, you wouldn't want to advertise to people who are never going to smoke marijuana. It's completely irrelevant, right? So 14 million people I think is a fair estimate. Now, out of those 14 million people, we can say that about 4 million, just as a rough estimate, about 4 million are not going to be particularly curious about the news and they're not really going to bother looking anything up. So we get 10 million left. So 10 million people in Canada that we have left that are going to probably hear about the legalization news, and they're going to be on average at least somewhat interested to actually go and read a little bit more about the news, read how it's going to work, and maybe take a look at some companies. So 10 million people, right? That's just in Canada. Now, outside of Canada, it's still going to be relevant. The news are going to be covered in the US and in many other countries by the news, but the people in those countries are not too relevant. So let's say that out of all the people in the US, the over 300 million people in the US, people in Germany, Australia, and all of those countries, let's say that about 15 million of those people matter. Well, I shouldn't have put an error here. But we have 15 million other people that are going to roughly matter when it comes to this sort of stuff outside of Canada. These 15 million people are going to be relevant in terms of advertising because in the future they might recognize your branding somewhere else and be a customer, right? I think that's a fair estimate. So in total we have 25 million people that are left over that are going to be relevant, that are going to hear about your news, and that are at least going to come across the name of your company when everything takes place. Over the course of a year, maybe over the course of 2 years, it's going to vary a little bit. Of course, a lot of people are going to hear about this whenever legalization does actually take place. But about 25 million people in the world, 10 million of them in Canada, are going to be relevant whenever this news is talked about, because those are going to be the people that are going to be at least somewhat interested in your product and might become potential customers in the future. So if they hear about your company, if they hear about your brands, that's going to be very, very relevant to them, because hearing about a brand first is very relevant, right? What I'm trying to say is, and I'm not doing a very good job, but to give you an analogy, if you think about a smartphone, the Google Pixel doesn't particularly come in mind. Generally, you think of either an iPhone or an Android because those phones were the first ones to come around, right? Advertising an iPhone when there was no other competition for phones that were similar to iPhone, so about the iPhone 3 area, was much more valuable in terms of establishing a brand name and sort of a loyal customer base than right now it would be to advertise a Google Pixel. Like a Google Pixel is still a good phone. Some people might be interested in it, but it is more valuable to advertise whenever there's less competition and whenever the industry is just starting out. Like the first smartphone that came around was much more impactful in terms of remaining in people's memory than all other phones, right? You guys probably understand this, but whenever you hear about something first, it's much more relevant than if you hear about it at some other point. So hopefully that makes sense. But anyways, 25 million people that are going to be advertised to. Let's say 5 million of these people are never going to come across Canopy Growth, so we have 20 million people left that are at least going to look at Canopy Growth. I think that's a fair estimate. And the only question that's left over is, what is the value of 20 million people at least taking a look at your company? Some of these people are going to become customers, some of these people are not. But overall, they're going to take a look at your company, they're going to take a look at your brand, and it's going to be one of the first brands that they have exposure to. So if you value this at $1 a person, which I think is a fair estimate, but I think it's a little bit of a lowball, that's $20 million in advertising, right? $1 is 20 million in free advertising. I really can't write with my mouse. But at $5, that would be 100 million. And 100 million in free advertising, I think, is pretty good. Just be aware that the free advertising that Canopy Growth gets, it's not going to be very impactful at the beginning. The free advertising, the fact that people look at your brand and it's the first brand that they are exposed to, that sort of stuff comes up over the long run as opposed to over the short run. So over the short run, Canopy Growth will be getting a lot of customers, but the fact that a lot of people are aware of their brand is going to be better for them in the long run, because that means that more people will be choosing their brand over other brands more often, and it's going to eventually generate their revenue. It's going to grow their brand value fairly significantly. So we're talking about long-term things here, and I think that's saying that about $5 a person from these 20 million people, I think that would be a fair estimate. This might be overestimating it a little bit, but still, I think that in terms of long run value, and we're talking about value here, we're not necessarily talking about what it would cost to advertise, we're talking about value. But long-term value, I think that saying 100 million in free advertising, I think that's fair, right? I don't know, is that fair? If any of you guys have better experience in terms of advertising, let me know, but I personally do know that advertising can get very expensive if you are targeting specific demographics that would potentially be interested in your product, and these 20 million people are that demographic. They would be potentially interested in your product. So at $5 per person when your industry is just starting out, I think that that's a fairly fair estimate, right? Or at least in value. Maybe you wouldn't pay the $5, but in terms of actually getting value, I think that $5 a person in terms of value is actually a fair estimate, right? So hopefully this is helpful. I don't know. I think these things are interesting to take a look at. Of course, these are very rough estimates. I pretty much averaged everything out and just roughly talked about some different things, but I think that's fair enough, right? So anyways, let me know what you think. Maybe I'm off fairly significantly, maybe I'm not, but Canopy Growth should be in a position where they're going to be talked about quite a bit, and that is going to be serving as free advertising fairly significantly. So let me know. Maybe 100 million is too much, maybe it's going to be closer to 20 million, but it really depends on how you do your estimates, I think, and it depends on what you value the actual exposure at. And I don't know, we'll see. But hopefully this helped. Hopefully it was an interesting question to talk about. If there's anything else that I can talk about, let me know. I actually like doing these types of things, but they're very difficult to do whenever you're talking about something that's going to happen a year from now and you don't exactly know all of the dynamics that are going to occur. So, I don't know. Leave a like if this helped.